One of my favorite things to work on when I'm painting or drawing is creating natural looking textures. So sometimes it's something like smooth and subtle skin texture like in this portrait, and for other types of work, sometimes it's things like painting wrinkles, pores, and facial hair. But if you're starting to paint pictures of people and animals, a very common texture that you're going to come across again and again is hair and fur. And so that's what I'm going to be showing you how to paint today. It's actually a pretty easy one. It's a small study of hair or fur textures using one color. Here's the photo of my completed texture study. This one is done on clayboard and I'm using my Harder and Steenbeck Infinity 2024. I'm using the color black by Schmincke Aerocolors, which is an acrylic ink, and I have it reduced about 1:1 with distilled water. I have all of my contour lines transferred over to my clayboard panel. I did this in graphite using an HB pencil. And you might see a few letters written on my panel here, and what I did was I wrote in the letter L to designate where the light values or the highlights are going to be, and I wrote in the letter D for the dark values and the shadows. A lot of times with hair textures, it's kind of easy to get lost when you're painting or drawing, so writing out the placement of the highlights or shadows might help you out. I'm spraying it around 25 psi give or take, and the first thing that I'm doing here is spraying in some of the shadow values above and below this group of hair in the center. It's just a few overlapping strokes, and I'm making sure that I'm spraying air the entire time by rocking the trigger backward and forward, but I'm always pressing down to spray air. When I get to the end of each stroke, I rock the trigger fully forward to stop the paint flow so paint doesn't build up at the end of each one. Sometimes this is called a barbell, where you just kind of have like a large blob of paint at the end of each one. Once I get those shadow values in, I'm going to lightly glaze some of this paint over the center where the highlight's going to be. This is going to give me something to erase into. And because this is the first layer, I'm applying that paint very lightly. I'm just not pulling too far back on the trigger, because if it's too dark, there's going to be a lot of contrast between the paint and the erasing. And that's actually how I'm going to be adding this texture in. I'm going to be removing paint from the surface. So I'm going to start out first with an eraser, and then I'll use an X-Acto blade later on. What I like to do with my eraser, which I'm showing on the panel here, is just cut the end of it off with an X-Acto blade so I have a very sharp edge. And then with a light to a moderate amount of pressure, I'm going to start removing this paint following the flow of the hair. Now, one thing that I'm always thinking to myself about is trying not to think of individual hairs. I'm thinking more in bunches of hair or locks of hair. I'm trying to overlap the strokes with the eraser, and you can see how subtle it is here because there's not that much paint down. There's not really much contrast between the darks and lights. This allows me to slowly build up layer by layer of texture. It makes it a lot more forgiving, and it makes it a lot easier to do as well. For this first part, I'm going to be switching off between a few different types of erasers, but they're all soft erasers. Like the one I'm using here is the Faber-Castell 7056. One of the reasons I've been using these soft erasers more and more over the last few years is that I notice they pull out a very even value of paint. They don't add too much texture like the more aggressive erasers. And so now for this first part, I have my values in place. I know where the highlights are going to be for this group of hair within the center, and I know where the shadows are going to be surrounding it. And so now what I'm going to do from here is lightly glaze another layer of this paint over the top, mainly over the highlights, so I have another layer to erase into. And then switch over to another soft eraser and start blocking in the shapes of light. And while I'm doing this, I'm always paying attention to that reference photo, trying to follow the flow of the hair. You'll see that as I erase a few of these in, I switch back over to the airbrush to lightly glaze in some paint where the shadows are going to be. And then back over to the eraser for another thin layer of highlights on top. And I think you can get a good sense of the process that I'm going to be using throughout this whole little study. It's basically working layer by layer, just adding some paint down, erasing into it, adding some more. But one thing that I keep reminding myself over and over is to not go too dark with this paint too quickly, because if I do, when I erase into dark values, there's going to be a lot of contrast between the light and dark. And one thing you may notice is that if you have really high contrast in between eraser marks or scratches from the X-Acto blade, it might start to look more like straw than natural hair. For this one lock of hair in the center, what I'm doing here is adding a gradient to it, a bit of a darker value on the left and on the right side of it. And I'm just doing that with the airbrush freehand, just spraying on a very light amount of this paint on the left and right side, making sure to leave the center a little bit lighter. And what that does is starts to create a very subtle illusion here where it looks like this part of the hair is raised up toward the light source because it's brighter, it's lighter, and then the area on the left and the right side of it looks like it's rounding away from the light. And what that does is starts to give off the illusion of a three-dimensional space on this 2D surface. I could push that a little bit further, which is what I'm doing here, using my eraser within that highlight area to pull out more paint, make that area brighter. And while I'm doing this, I'm not just randomly erasing paint, I'm always trying to follow the flow of each lock of hair or each tuft of hair. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm never trying to think of individual hairs, so what I'm going to do here is for my completed painting on the left side of the screen, I'm going to put a blur on it so everything is out of focus. This way you can't see the individual hairs. And you can see that once that blur is added over the top, it's a lot easier to notice where the lights and darks are and how everything blends from one value to the next. And so that's what I'm thinking about as I'm adding in these first few layers, just these areas of light that slowly fade into dark. And even when it's super blurry like this, where you can't see any of the individual hairs, the image itself still looks like hair. It just looks like it's out of focus. So I'll remove that blur so you can see what we're working towards. And what I'm doing with my painting on the right side is going back to my eraser, and I have it cut to like a chiseled edge here. And when it's cut like this, I can pull out some thinner lines, so I could adjust the width of each one of these eraser strokes by how I use this eraser. If the edge of the eraser is rounded or kind of blunt, I could pull out some softer, larger highlights, and if I cut it to a chiseled edge, I could pull out some thin lines. But there's always going to be a limit to how thin of a line you can get with an eraser. So if I want a really thin line, like a hairline, that's when I'm going to switch over to some sort of blade, like an X-Acto blade. So before I get to that and start adding some real detail in here, I just want to finish working through each strand of hair using my eraser only. And I'm following the same techniques that I just went over. I'm glazing on a thin layer of paint with the airbrush, just a light amount, then erasing into it. One thing that I try to do that I always find helpful and just makes it look a little bit more natural is to ease into each one of the eraser strokes so that there isn't a really sharp starting or ending point to each mark drawn in. And the way that I do that, which is really hard to show on video, is I use less pressure for the start of each eraser mark, more pressure in the middle so it gets a little bit brighter, and then less pressure at the end again. This way each mark or stroke from the eraser subtly blends from one to the next, and I always like to try to overlap them and start and stop in different points so that a pattern doesn't look like it's building up. You'll see that as I'm doing this, I'm also varying the width of some of these hairs, and the way that I get the thinner lines is just what I showed before. I cut the eraser to kind of like a chiseled edge, and then I can use that to pull out a very thin line. While I was doing this, I was also experimenting with a few different types of erasers that I bought over the past few months. So if you see a few different ones here, just understand that they are all soft erasers. None of these are aggressive ink erasers. So as I'm finishing this first part up, I only used erasers for the highlights. And it's just like what I talked about earlier, focusing on the strands of hair, making sure they're a little bit brighter in the center so they look like they're raised up toward the light source. For this first part, I didn't use any sort of knife or X-Acto blade to remove paint from the panel. It was just the airbrush and the erasers, and I get a final texture that looks like this. I apologize for the shaky video. I was just holding this by hand, and you can see that we get a pretty convincing looking hair or fur texture. It's just a little bit on the softer side. It doesn't have the sharpness or the detail that the completed painting has on the left, so in order to add that, this is where the X-Acto blade is going to come in. In this first part, I'm pulling out some thinner lines, so I'm lying the edge of the blade nearly flat against the surface of the clayboard and lightly applying pressure as I follow the hair flow. As I do this, I can pull out some very thin lines, and I can also adjust the width of these lines by how flat the blade is against the surface. If I just use the point or the tip of the blade, I can scratch out a very thin line, but if I lie more of the blade flat against the surface, I can pull out a wider line, so I'm just kind of adjusting the width as I'm working here. And just like the eraser, I'm always trying to make sure that I'm adding some variety and randomness within these lines. So I start and stop in different points, I adjust the width, and I allow some of them to overlap. One thing that I want to add here is that if you have any background in drawing or took some drawing classes, maybe watched some videos, you're probably very familiar with this technique. If you aren't, here's a quick demo. I'm using an HB pencil, adding some to the surface, an even value, and then blending it out with a blending stump. And when graphite is applied to a very smooth surface like this clayboard, I can scratch it away with an X-Acto blade just like I can with the paint. And whether you're doing this in drawing like graphite or charcoal or in an airbrush painting like this one, it's really important that you practice it and get these techniques down for yourself. A technique like this is not difficult to do at all, but it takes some practice and some patience. You have to kind of get a feel for the eraser and the X-Acto blade. One thing that I try to do, especially when I'm scratching paint with the blade, is to move it pretty quickly in kind of like a sweeping motion. This way I don't get any sort of shakiness like a wobble or a jitter within each one of these hairs that I'm scratching out. In this part, I'm holding the blade overhand, kind of like a long-handled paintbrush, and I'm lying more of the blade flat against the surface so that these lines are a bit wider when I scratch them out. And as I continue along with this texture study, expanding the hair out a little bit, I'm just following those same 3 techniques over and over. The airbrush to lay down some paint, using the eraser, and then I followed up with some glazing of paint, and then finally some scratching with the X-Acto blade. And then at the end, for each one of these locks of hair, I always come back with the airbrush and glaze a little bit of paint on the left and the right side, just to build up that gradient so it's brighter in the center, darker on the edges. You'll see along the top part of the painting, some parts of the hair are a bit more recessed, they're darker. All I did was spray some more paint in there to darken up the value. And so that's going to be it for this one. This is where I'm going to finish it up. It's definitely a bit of a time-consuming process, but I promise you it's not difficult to do. It just takes some practice and some patience. So I hope that some of you guys give this one a shot and maybe use some of these techniques in your portraits or paintings of animals. As always, I want to thank you guys so much for being here and for watching this video. I hope it was helpful, and I wish you all the very best in your own paintings or drawings. Before I go, like always, I want to say thank you so much to the very generous support of the current channel members that are scrolling up on the screen right now. They really help keep this channel going, so thank you guys. I'd like to welcome the newest channel member this week, that's Xavier, and I'd like to welcome back Grant, Patrick, and Krister. Be well, everyone. Have a great week, and I'll see you back here next Friday. Take care.